Hey guys, just want to give you a quick update while I was on my lunch break from work. Given the fact that tomorrow is actually China's National Day, so October 1st, they're celebrating the 70th anniversary of their communist regime. We're actually moving into now the 17th week of increased tension and protests from Hong Kong. Basically, China, knowing that they're going to be protesting against the communist regime, they increased their military presence in Hong Kong as a result. They actually had around 3,000 to 5,000 troops in months before, and now they have around 10,000 to 12,000, which is actually quite a large number. So to put things into perspective, the United States has 1,000 troops in Syria altogether, and now they have like around 12,000 troops just in Hong Kong. So this actually might be the largest force from China in Hong Kong in both of their history. So, from what I saw on Sunday, it was just complete bedlam. There was bricks being thrown, Molotov cocktails being thrown by protesters. The police violently cracked down as a result. Police said that they arrested around 146 people on Sunday. They fired around 300 tear gas canisters. It was actually, I think, 328. 306 rubber bullets, and at least 25 people were sent to the hospital. So this is probably the most violent day that they've had since they started protesting, like I said, around 17 weeks ago. The police are actually now using water cannons too. They're loaded with blue dye in order to identify the protesters more effectively. There was actually an Indonesian journalist that was shot in the face with rubber bullets, or at least beanbags. We're not actually sure what she was shot with. But either way, it's not a good look for the government if they're shooting at, the media. But apparently her and other journalists were actually, saying, hey, we're journalists, don't shoot at us. And the police shot at them anyway. So I saw a photo of her face, and it was just completely swollen. Her eye was like sewn shut. She looked like she was in a boxing match. She just looked destroyed. The police are actually, using pepper spray too in other areas on journalists. So this wasn't the only attack on journalists. So people are beginning to question if the government's just attempting to suppress information or coverage, which would make sense, totally understandable. But just keep in mind, any increased action or clampdown on the protesters, it just risks any trade talks with the United States. So Trump is definitely watching this very closely. It's also worth noting that Hong Kong's special status, it ties its currency to the dollar, so it's called the Hong Kong dollar. So it actually grants China a source to the dollar. So this trade war, as a result, then it's kind of shifting away from tariffs, but rather increased regulatory oversight from the SEC. And there's actually starting to be real legislative pressure against China on human rights and finance. There was a bill for Hong Kong's democracy. There was also Rubio and Shaheen, the senators that were both Republican and Democrat. So good that bipartisan legislation is trying to be created. But what they're trying to do, though, is create kind of convince the federal pension I fund not to follow a new benchmark. It's the MSCI All Country World Index, simply because it invests in Chinese companies, so including those that are actually sanctioned by Washington already. The Nasdaq also said that it would make it hard for Chinese small caps to launch IPOs on the exchange. There's been that ban against Huawei. It's China's largest telecom device maker. I'm sure you guys have heard of them. It's also just overall Wall Street. I mean, historically speaking, they've always loved to invest in China. Financial products over the years have given American investors access to the Chinese markets. So JP Morgan indexes, they've been adding Chinese securities. Both the MSCI and FTSE from the UK are now increasing their weightings to China. That means more fund managers are mandated to invest in Chinese companies if they're following the benchmark. So if you invest in some kind of index as those, then you're going to be tracking that index. So if you have like the S&P 500, for example, that's 500 companies, you're going to be investing in one of those companies by default. So anyway, but it's kind of like a one-way street that's created then, because China doesn't have these kind of benchmarks that are set for the U.S. market. So basically, it's just a one-way street with U.S. dollars just flowing to China rather than the other way around. So it's great that Washington's actually looking into this. Many Chinese stocks actually fell pretty hard on Friday following financial media rumors that the White House was actually looking at maybe, or at least delisting these Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges. So, but anyway, Trump did say, though, that they weren't considering, but maybe they are behind closed doors, I suspect. But anyway, back to Hong Kong. So on Monday, authorities announced that they're upholding a ban on a planned National Day Democracy March, citing security concerns. Surprise, surprise. So expect Tuesday's protests to be the worst yet. Tuesday will be, again, when China celebrates their National Day and 70 years as a communist nation. It's pretty clear that China is preparing to control Hong Kong if the local government, headed by Carrie Lam, just loses control even further. Hong Kong protesters are just going to have, a democracy march instead. And again, that's against government's calls. It's pretty clear that, Hong Kongers are having less and less freedom, and it's becoming more and more like Beijing. With these legal rallies that are banned, online forums used by the largely leaderless movement have called for protests across the city in an effort to stretch the police resources thin, which is a pretty good tactic, pretty appropriate for the situation. If you go around the city, they're going to have to follow you around and, not have as many police on duty. So school and university students actually took part in a one-day class boycott today. So you can begin to see why China sent more troops as a result, with protests becoming more violent and National Day coming up tomorrow. As I spoke in a previous video regarding Hong Kong, the movement was protesting originally just the extradition bill headed by Carrie Lam. But now that the bill was scrapped by her, the movement's just calling for free elections and less intervention from Beijing. Carrie Lam actually flew to Beijing today to celebrate the National Day in the capital. Obviously not a good look for her, but certainly expected of her by the Chinese government. President Xi, however, did affirm his vow to uphold Hong Kong's special status of one nation, two systems, but it's clear that China keeps pushing its way into Hong Kong's political scene. I think they're just biding their time until 2047, when it fully will be incorporated into the Chinese government and become communists and no longer capitalists. It's just crazy to think, even like people like my client's mother, she lived in China for 6 years. She told me this weekend that, many Chinese have no idea that Xi is serving for life. She said that about half the people that she asked, if they were aware that he passed a law to be president in perpetuity, or at least until he dies. She said about half just weren't even aware. She was teaching English there and told me some other things that I didn't know about. I mean, I knew that they had surveillance cameras in mosques for Muslims, but I didn't know that they had them in churches too. So they're monitoring Christians and Muslims alike. You actually have to set up an appointment to go prayer there. So you have like an hour appointment just to prayer, which is kind of crazy. She also mentioned just being a Western. The negative looks she received just increased over the past, 5 years, she was saying, and she just no longer felt safe. So she actually just moved back to the U.S. But just overall, just pay attention to tomorrow, October 1st. We'll see how the protests, go. We'll see if they get a little bit more violent. The world's definitely going to be watching. So thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.